run-up to this year's United Nations Climate Change Conference, officials delivered a serious warning. Despite so many lofty promises to take action, carbon emissions continue to grow and may warm the planet even more than we expected. So, as nearly 200 nations gather in Madrid to discuss this crisis, what tops their agenda? What should top their agenda? What prevents nations from taking tougher action? And how can the world work together more effectively to protect the environment? To discuss this and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Wu Changhua, Executive Director of the Professional Association for China's Environment, and Dr. Bruce McGee, President and CEO of the McMillan-McGee Corporation. That's a Canadian firm that specializes in decontaminating polluted sites. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Jonathan Betts. It's a serious conversation. We keep hearing the warnings. The climate is in crisis. The planet is in crisis. So, as you know, the nations gather here to talk about the climate crisis in the coming days here in Madrid. What do you think is going to be the biggest expectation from this conference?
There are at least 2 or 3 major items or tasks the Madrid COP needs to deliver. One, basically something called a Paris guidebook, because we now have a Paris Agreement. How do we make sure we coordinate the implementation of the Paris Agreement? That's going to be a very, very important task to achieve at this COP. The second one is really start taking the support from developed countries to developing countries in terms of tackling climate change, particularly the financial support. And in the meantime, as you mentioned earlier, the scientists are telling us actually we are basically living in crisis, and it's accelerated crisis. So countries, nations need to lift up their commitments in the Paris Agreement, which is not adequate at this moment. So those are the 3 major things probably that will be deep dived in Madrid.
I mean, let's talk about the 2015 Paris Climate Accord here, because as you mentioned, this conference is a way to try to finalize some of the agreements reached in 2015. So, Bruce, there is this concern that there's too much bureaucracy, that the nations are not moving fast enough, that we're still talking about how to process and handle this accord from 4 years ago. Do you agree with that concern?
I think so. I think that if there's a call to action, then it's time to act. And I think where we're sitting with the politics and the issues and the bureaucracy that you mentioned, it makes it difficult to act with reason and technical innovation and an agenda that brings in both people and businesses to come up with the solutions to pollution that we see out here. And I'm not an expert on climate change, but I have been in the environmental remediation business for 23 years. And there's a point where policy has to come together in a way that it enables an active agenda.
Yeah, what kind of action would you like to see, especially since you mentioned you are a businessman?
Good question. The kinds of things that we can speak to when it comes to a technical innovation that addresses climate change, clearly at a high level, things like sustainable energy sources, going from combustible fuels to electric cars, for example. And we see that growing rapidly. We see a culture of change in our children, where when you ask them what's the next car you're going to buy, is it going to be an electric car or a combustible car? Chances are they're going to seriously look at buying an electric car. I've traveled around the world. I've traveled to different places where I've seen this kind of action take place. I've been in Churchill in India, where the airport is a brand new airport and is completely and 100% powered by solar energy. So I think there's movement there, there's initiative there, there's momentum, but I think it really has to come to the level of awareness that it brings political hope, if you like, to the issue that's...
But are you talking about cultural change where the public embraces these ideas, or do you think this should come more from the government level?
For sure, cultural change has to be part of the synergy, part of the equation. But cultural change is a whisper in the wind if it doesn't take effect at a political level. So it has to communicate at both levels.
Yeah, I definitely second what Bruce has said. I think, of course, negotiation is more like a government's negotiation. Governments need to negotiate with each other, reaching certain deals. Your obligations, my obligations there. But in order to really address the issues, business has a big role to play, right? For business, actually, it's incentives, disincentives, right? For instance, we need urgently to price on carbon. And even on the financial side, actually, we need to internalize the climate risk actually into the financial sector as well. In the meantime, I think the culture part, particularly today in global social media, the Swedish girl actually, Greta Thunberg, has really made a sort of a striking effort recognized globally that the younger generation is waking up and they are demanding for change. So very importantly, they are adding pressure to governments to take more active actions actually to tackle climate change. Things are coming together nicely.
Her words are resonating. You do feel this pressure, but is it getting to the top? Do you think that government leaders are taking this concern seriously enough?
I think she's getting there. I definitely see, when she spoke at the UN back in September, UN Climate Action Summit, UN leaders, political leaders from around the world actually were responding, were paying attention to that. She's only a voice and a face. If you look around her, actually, younger generation are looking up to her. So since last summer and within a year time, more than 1.6 million young people around the world in more than 100 countries actually were participating in that process. So that's positive or fascinating in a way. They needed to put pressure on the government. As we're all seeing here, the government actions are not really, catching up with what's needed to happen, and that's becoming very phenomena. The younger generation is waking up, is taking actions, demand for change.
And Bruce, you're nodding your head over here. Help me understand, how big do you think the disconnect is between the groundswell we see from protesters, from activists who are saying we need to act now, and government leaders?
Well, it's a good question. I sometimes can't quantify that gap between the disconnect, but
Is that big of a gap?
It could be, but I also live in Canada, and I look at what's going on in the United States, which is our neighbor, and I look at the groundswell of enthusiasm amongst young voters when they look at Bernie Sanders and his team presenting things like the Green New Deal and all kinds of other initiatives that really resonate loudly, I think, with a generation of people who have taken to heart the sense of urgency in the issues around the environment. So I don't know how that gap gets closed, because the leadership right now doesn't necessarily even believe in climate change, for example. So there's a disconnect in that aspect of the leadership. But if the leadership doesn't listen to the voters and the groundswell and their understanding of the issues the way they believe they should be addressed, then clearly something is going to happen and change.
Well, one source of anger we do hear from that groundswell, from protesters, from activists, especially when it comes to the Madrid summit in the coming days, is that it's almost too late to be focusing on 2015 and trying to meet those goals. We need to change the goals. We need to, ask for deeper cuts. We need to ramp up the pledges. Do you think that is realistic at this point? Do you think that could happen in Madrid?
That's what's needed, but it's going to be a very difficult process. Madrid happens starting next Monday. You do not expect magic happens just within a couple of weeks there. But it's a necessary process. It's a global, it's a UN platform that the leaders need to come together, have a serious conversation. Because scientists are telling us basically the crisis is intensifying. We continuously actually emit more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the temperature continues to rise. We experience more extreme weather events and natural disasters there. So the lives on Earth are experiencing this sort of challenges, right, at this moment. So there is a sense of urgency at this moment. But as you said, if you look at the global multilateralism, right, the multilateral process, the Paris Agreement, we have something called NDC, right, and nationally determined commitments. That's what we have within the Paris Agreement. If you add them up, all the commitments by countries voluntarily at this moment, we're definitely not on the track towards 1.5 degrees temperature rise or even 2 degrees. We're literally on a 3 to 5 degrees Celsius sort of pathway. That's horrifying, not only for this generation, but for the next future generations there as well. So I'm hoping that somehow next week, next 2 weeks in Madrid, that sense of urgency will somehow be recognized by negotiators, government leaders there, so that they will be able to lift up their commitments. But first thing first, they do need to clean up, to put things together now. They said they're going to deliver. That part hasn't really happened yet.
Well, when you look at these commitments, I mean, with the United States pulling out of its commitments and abandoning this accord, a lot of people are looking at China and are hoping, fingers crossed, that China might ramp up its commitments, that it's in the position and the power to and wants to be a global leader when it comes to cleaning up the environment. Do you think that's possible?
I wouldn't say whether it's possible. I think it's already happening. Chinese leadership actually in tackling climate change issues at the global level is more and more recognized. A couple of ways of looking at it. One, if you look at the commitment Chinese government made already to the Paris Agreement, we're literally overachieving that now. If you look at carbon intensity target, we're overachieving that. We're pretty much on the track towards achieving renewable energy. installations. China is already leader there. Of course, now looking into the next decade, the next 10 years, between 2020 and 2030, the commitment basically we need to peak our emissions as soon as possible, no later than 2030. Secondly, we need to really achieve the carbon intensity targets to 60 to 65%. We are already above 45% now.
But a lot of people say that China's goals are too conservative and that it could be doing more.
Compared to what? More than what? I think there is a realistic issue there. China remains to be a developing country. If you look at the 1.5 billion people, we have 400 million people in the middle class. Then we have there's 1 million people actually moving up towards middle class. Then we have this 900 million people still sort of at the bottom of the ladder, right? The development remains a top priority. But the good thing is the Chinese government actually is literally turning this sort of technical climate change into a development issue, into a driver towards energy transition, and also very importantly as a driver for economic transformation. So things are coming together, comparatively speaking, nicely. So yeah, it's one piece, it's one strategy. China is on the track, but you could always say it's not adequate. We all need to take up more efforts. But as you said, U.S. is already drifting out of the process. How do they take on their own responsibility there? We don't know yet, right? You cannot rely on China to solve all the problems. It's a global effort. We are all in this together.
So with China trying to honor its commitments, Bruce, I mean, what do you think is the biggest stumbling block to try to get more countries on board here?
I really don't know, but I would say from a layman's perspective, I think that sense of urgency has been pervasive, and I think many countries are looking at what can we do to both technically, politically, or otherwise, or culturally, to deal with the climate change issue. And I think if you go back 20 years ago, this wasn't really even a topic of conversation. So we've moved a long ways. I don't know how to come up with a calculation that says here's exactly what we have to do. And in some cases, what business does, and I'm a business guy, and what we try to maintain is a balance between the economics and the technology and the best efforts. And so what's the best effort? What is the best we can do today? And I think that still remains a little bit of a question. So we need to use the cultural lever, and we need to communicate to everyone. Maybe ride your bike for one day a week and reduce the emissions and things like that can benefit the environment. Because we can't just ask for a solution and expect it to happen. We have to be part of the solution.
And it takes a lot of work. We're going to continue this conversation, much more to talk about. It's a complicated subject, but first, a quick break here on Dialogue. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN, and we are talking about climate change. It's a big topic, a big issue. Let's go back to China's fight here, China's effort to try to do its part to solve this crisis. This week, China released an annual report on climate change. It revealed a new section concerning, quote, human health. So help us understand, how significant is that, and is this a pivot in direction?
It's an important addition to the national strategy. For a long time, we've been mostly focusing on mitigation, reducing improving energy efficiency, reducing the emissions. Of course, we talk about adaptation, right? But somehow, national strategy focus is less on that. Now, we're now putting public health on top of the agenda because we are now living in climate change. If you look at extreme weathers, events, diseases, public health risks, including infectious diseases, they are already reality. So this is a very important step taken by the government to make sure we pay more attention to the public health impact of climate change so that the people will become more resilient, be better prepared. In the meantime, the healthcare system needs to also be enhanced. Make sure when things happen, the healthcare system in this country will be able to respond very effectively. So from that perspective, definitely it's a major step forward.
And what does it mean on the ground here? Do you expect this to actually lead to changes in government policy? What is the signal here? I
think there will be, you will probably see more like a warning system, monitoring system, and of course, if things happen, for instance, infectious disease, how do we make sure, emergency response system so that they wouldn't really spread to impact too many people, and trying to control them and prevent them as much as possible. So those are the things probably I could literally imagining that's going to happen.
You know, when this report came out, there was also a news conference held by the Vice Minister of Ecology and Environment who talked about countries lacking the political will to fight climate change. What do you mean? What do you think he means by that?
It's very simple and easy and obvious. If you look at the Paris Agreement, the global process, developed countries committed to provide financial support for developing countries. If I look back, actually trace the history, so back in 2015, there was a commitment to say, you know, industrialized countries need to provide more financial support for developing countries, and leading up to $100 billion per year by 2020. Where is the money? We don't know yet. The reason is that the context, actually, the global context of economic growth has been slowing down. Of course, it's really depressing for everyone, for every country. No country can survive, actually, if they stay away from it. So that really adds the pressure you know, for the government to say, because it has to be public funding, right? Meaning it's taxpayers' money for developing countries there. So that sort of incentive aspiration no longer there, right? So it's getting so difficult, more and more difficult. Basically say, where's the money? And on the other side, actually, so this is agreement all the countries that have signed up to, you need to honor, you know, your commitment. So from that perspective, I think the Vice Minister has a particular point to make there, which is going to be a major task for Madrid COP as well.
Well, and this is also a major source of irritation for, like, the United States and President Trump, who feels like it's not fair for developed countries to shoulder more of the burden than developing countries. They look at China, a developing country, but also the world's second largest economy and the world's largest emitter of carbon. So how do you respond to that complaint that developed countries should not be shouldering so much and that developing countries could shoulder more of the burden?
If we just simply argue against each other, there's no way, right? We need to go back to the international agreement, right? Because we said, if you look at the Kyoto process and if you then look at the Paris Agreement, so there are rules set up already, agreed upon by global community already, with the obligations, responsibilities, partnership, working together, even commitments of all kinds of things. We do need to honor that. That's the foundation for us to work together, rather than pointing fingers to each other, say, oh, you said you're a developing country, you're no longer anymore, you're the second largest economy, you should take on more responsibility. That's totally waste of time. We do need to honor the international process. That's why multilateral governance, negotiation, or multilateralism becomes so critical, because climate change is a global challenge. We're all in this together, and that's needed actually for everyone to come together at the UN platform to negotiate, to talk each other and reach agreement. Then we honor that sort of agreement in order to really tackle the challenge.
I mean, Bruce, I'd love to get your thoughts on all this, especially as we mentioned, you're a businessman, you work in this area of cleaning up the environment. I mean, how much do you rely on government support, private support, and do you get the support that you think you deserve?
50-50 no. I find this quite fascinating. The developing nations, to me, provide a great opportunity to even test different approaches to mitigating climate change. I mean, I think of what happened in China when the phone companies in North America came over here thinking that they were going to sell a lot of phones in people's homes, and turned out it became a cellular phone revolution. So maybe there's technical innovations that developing companies can embrace, that can actually leapfrog where the industrial nations have come from, and maybe move away from carbon-based energy sources to other based sources like solar panels, like wind and other methods. And sometimes those opportunities we just don't know what they are. I know there's in Africa, where we've done some work, there's technologies where people are putting tiny little solar panels on their homes, and getting the energy they need to do things like run a cell phone and some equipment or some lifestyle appliances. But I still think it's an opportunity, and I think when you start building these kind of agendas where you're speaking between politicians and agreements and accords and things that have come out of negotiation, the plan to action requires a lot of detail and a lot of work to really get things implemented. And I'm not so sure as a layman, when I look back at this very topical subject, whether a lot of that's actually been done. Where is the opportunity in some of these developing nations to even change the way energy is used and produced?
Well, let's talk more about your company here. Sure. And its work in China, and you mentioned Africa, and obviously you're a Canadian firm, relies a lot on technology.
Yes.
Correct? So help us understand, how much of a role do you think technology and innovation is going to play in solving this climate crisis?
I think it's everything. I think, I mean, the metric we use is a technical metric. It's how much emission into the atmosphere our existence on this planet plays. So I think it's a very, very big part. I think a part that doesn't get talked about a lot is population control. And maybe that's a topic for another conversation, but we have a lot of people on the planet that are burning carbon. But technology, I think, is going to be a very, very big part. For us, to be able to advance the environmental agenda that we work with, which is groundwater and soil, we have to present and use proven technology that actually works. And do we get funding from the government to do it? Only when they're paying us to clean up their projects. We don't really get funding for us to develop the technology. So someone's had to go through the process of risk and investment to come up with a business that goes out and actually uses this technology. And where do we see the businesses in other environmental sectors? I think you see it in companies that are using solar panels, companies that are developing battery storage devices that allow cars to go further. There's just a whole bunch of opportunities out there that I think are going to contribute to a cleaner planet.
I think from the technology perspective, I have to say, actually, studies over studies had already made the point. We have technologies today. It's not like we're waiting for tomorrow's technologies to address the climate change issues.
We're building now.
Yeah, literally there now. So the question is to say, how come we're not really deploying them at the scale, at the pace that are going to really meet up with the challenges, what scientists are telling us today? So government has a big role to play. For business, basically, they run business, right? If there is a business case, really good business case, financial capital will flow, will invest in business, business will innovate, because this is their market, right? So fundamentally, from the government perspective, besides laws, regulations, stuff like that, they do need to send a very strong signal, the price on carbon. Right, and that's becoming more and more prominent today. Even on the financial side, I think today more and more conversation are shifting towards the financial sector. Basically say, look, climate change is a risk. You do need to price on climate risk in the financing sector as well. So I think pieces are coming together. Government already made a commitment. We could see that's not adequate to the Paris Agreement at this moment. We do hope that somehow countries will lift up. In the meantime, actually, there are technologies available. There are a lot of business people actually trying to make it the business case, and the financial institutions are gradually coming on board, seriously looking to say, wait a second, we cannot continue to invest in fossil fuel, high carbon industries anymore. We need to invest in less, even zero carbon or net zero carbon sectors there. So things are coming together. Then plus the public. When the public sort of awakening to this call, they will make their decision about consumption. Hopefully they're going to change their behavior and purchase products that's probably less carbon intensive, even clean, whatever, and take public transportation and whatever they can change on the individual side. So if you look at all the pieces of the puzzle, hopefully somehow they're going to come together very quickly. That seems to be the trend, but somehow to get there, that seems to be, we still have to go through some difficult curves.
Well, it's also a trick to get all these to line up perfectly at the same moment here. And so I want to talk about that point you brought about. We have the technology. It's just deploying that technology. Why do you think it's so difficult to get that technology deployed?
I think your response is perfect. And I think when it comes down to government role in business, for us to develop the opportunity from the government role, it really gets down to their policies. And if they come up with environmental policies with enforcement where they say, you have to clean this up by this certain time or you're going to be fined, penalized, or criminalized, that puts a huge motivation on industry and government for technology to act. So I think what we monitor, and we do this globally in different countries around the world, is what is the policy around your environmental agenda? What are the regulations that are enforceable, and which ones are people actually having to engage with? And where can we help? Where can we bring our technology into the industry in a way that's profitable for us and does a good thing for you? And for example, we've been looking at China for 9 years, and I've never seen, on a global basis, a country that has accelerated its environmental policy so aggressively and so quickly as they've done here in the last 4 years in China.
I think that's a great point, sort of seconding, the China's efforts at this moment. As you said, when you look at China's leadership, it's not simply say for the sake of climate change issues. There's because we have a responsibility. We need to take some efforts to really reduce the carbon emissions. It's not treated at that level. Rather, it's really strategically shifting how the country will develop itself, develop its future.
Well, this is internal demands.
Absolutely. And plus internally, and so this alignment between internal demand and also global demand. So somehow in this country, you can see that perfectly. That's the case, as Bruce mentioned, in this sector. China definitely is also making its case. Basically, we need to do it, not just talk about it. We are doing it, putting laws, regulations, policy incentives together so that to drive technology innovation from the business perspective, that's going to attract a financial flow. You see investment into clean energy or clean environmental sectors there, and hopefully somehow the market scale up will be accelerated there.
Bruce, a UN official recently said that we need some quick wins. What do you think that means, and what are some quick wins that could work?
It sounds
are there any quick wins?
No, I was going to say it sounds like a real political statement and wishful thinking. I don't know if there's a quick win. I know that cinch by the inch, hard by the yard is a kind of what you have to do to make progress. So maybe a quick win is that everyone gets together on a global level and takes this issue very seriously and puts their money behind it, puts their money where their mouth is on policy and on funding. So maybe the quick win is at the political level. I've never had a quick win except
John,
I
I'll give you the last word briefly.
Yeah, I doubt it. I think because we're facing huge challenge about multilateralism, right? If you look at the crisis, and people are challenging the power of multilateralism, and they are challenging the relevance of multilateralism, and also challenging the legitimacy of multilateralism. And that's probably the biggest challenge for the global community to come together. Whether we will be staying together to address the global climate challenges, that remains a question to be answered.
And that's the bottom line. It's one country, one person cannot do it all. It has to be everybody doing it together. All righty. Bruce, McGee, Wu-Chang-Hua, thank you both for your time today. We appreciate it. Complicated conversation, complicated talk, but we'll see what happens in the next coming days with this climate conference. That's all the time we have for this edition of Dialogue. I'm Jonathan Betts. Thank you so much for watching. Keep it here. There's still much more ahead on CGTN.